Welcome back to the channel. It's good to be back here in the studios, and it's good to do another video. It's been a while. People who follow me on Substack and on Twitter will know that I've been in Europe. That's right. Twice a year, I try to bundle all the lectures I've been asked to give in Europe, and I go once or maybe twice, and I try to knock them all out, do all the lectures, visit a bunch of cities, and then come back to home base and do all the things I need to do. And I just got back from that trip, and I have already posted on the Plenary Session podcast feed one of the lectures I gave. This was a lecture given to the Danish Medical Association at their national conference on real-world evidence. It was the keynote about what real-world evidence can do and what it can't do. I'm going to make another lecture available. This was one that is about drug regulation, about limitations of clinical trials. If you're listening to the audio feed, you might listen to that immediately after this audio monologue. And if you're watching the video, well, you're going to have to wait for it. It's going to be a while. So while I was traveling, I was reminded yet again that on so many topics, Europe was simply way ahead of the United States when it comes to COVID-19 policy, when it comes to other sorts of important issues. And I wrote an op-ed in Sensible Medicine. It's entitled Denmark, where everyone agrees with me about COVID-19 and oncology. And it really felt that way. So let me walk you through what happened on the trip and why I felt so strongly. So I got to Denmark, and Denmark is a place where people have had a balanced view of COVID-19 this entire pandemic. They haven't done all the crazy shit we've done in this country. They've been more sensible. And after I gave my lecture, I had a couple of evenings of dinners with everybody where people asked me a lot of questions about the United States, about COVID-19 policy, about oncology policy. Let me walk you through some of what I learned. The first thing, COVID-19 policy. Pretty much Denmark and I agree on all of the issues. Number one, they were asking, what are your thoughts on masking in healthcare facilities, such as hospitals? I said, you should know. On Sensible Medicine, I've written piece after piece saying it doesn't make any sense. It needs to be abolished. They never had evidence to do it. And after a widespread vaccination campaign where you're giving everyone the opportunity to be vaccinated, there's no reason to do it. And of course, they agree in Denmark. That's why over a year ago, they stopped doing this stupidity. Meanwhile, here in San Francisco, we were still doing it as of when I left. I hear that finally the state law is going to change, but I think not everyone's going to follow the state law, and there's still going to be some holdouts, deranged holdouts. I've gotten an email from somebody who works at the University of Washington saying they're still going to enforce this brain dead policy. Why is it brain dead? Because whether or not you do the masking or not in the hospital, all of the people who've been in the hospital have either had COVID or are going to get COVID in the near future. So even apart from whether or not it works, the end point you're trying to change of preventing the spread of COVID, it's not actually going to even be addressed. It's going to spread through everybody in the short term. It's not like you can kick that can down the road. Next, there's the simple fact that you don't have evidence for the policy. You've never actually proven that having a universal mask policy in hospitals, the way you've implemented it among visitors in the hallways, actually does anything. You've never even subjected it to randomized appraisal. It is shameful to debut policies that you have just invented without testing it. And again, this is not the dark days of 2020. We're in 2023. What are you thinking by doing this policy? You have no evidence to support the policy, and it doesn't even have a rationale. And that combination makes it untenable. And the people in Denmark, of course, they're like, yeah, absolutely. The next thing we agreed about real quick, they asked me which of my articles generated the most controversy. And I think it was the piece I wrote in The Atlantic about the harms of masking kids are more certain than the benefits. And that piece was, I think, spot on at the time. I had been making that argument in MedPage Today, where I used to write a column. I've moved all that over to Substack. It's much better. And that piece really pointed out many of the absurdities of masking kids, one of which we don't have data. That's a big absurdity. The other absurdities, of course, the United States, were such zealots, we went down to 2 to 5. In Denmark, when they heard that we were actually masking 2-year-olds, they couldn't believe it. They said, you have to be an idiot to do that. And I said, yeah, you really do have to be an idiot to think that masking a 2-year-old is going to help. And yet there are many here, and they are in the ranks of the CDC. They're subscribing to groupthink. They're really thinking with their political brain and not their scientific brain. And people in Denmark don't understand that. Just today, as I'm recording this video, I got an email from somebody whose kid is in a California school where they're re-implementing the 2-year-old masking policy. And I thought to myself, it's still not over. That's how deranged our thinking is. Vaccination policy. We talked a lot about vaccines in Denmark, and they totally agree with me, which is the focus has to be on elderly people who don't yet have immunity from COVID-19. And by the way, we're talking about 2021. 2023, we can put that aside. We're talking about what we ought to have done in 2021 first half, where it was, of course, an important public health concern to vaccinate people in a rapid and efficient and thoughtful manner. And of course, you focus on elderly, unimmune. You don't put too much pressure on younger people, and you certainly don't go after kids. They agree with that philosophy wholeheartedly. There's no doubt about it. They say that's the right way to go. Then the booster after booster in young populations, nobody could understand it. They didn't think it had data, and they're not doggedly pursuing it in their country because they are also wise. Actually, at the end of this, I'm going to explain why I think we get along so well. Schools. When the Danes learned we had closed schools in liberal, coastal, elite cities for 18 months, they just told me, those poor children. And I think they're right. Those poor children. Those poor children were suffering, not because of coronavirus, because of course, all of them would get coronavirus eventually. CDC's seroprevalence was like 86% last I checked. Of course, they're suffering because the people who are governing them and setting their policies are so incompetent, they didn't understand that prolonged school closure was just punishing these kids, despite the fact that many of us tried to shout that from a mountaintop, writing op-ed after op-ed on that topic. Oncology. When it comes to my views on oncology, they were very well received in Denmark. We agree wholeheartedly cancer drugs, they cost so much, and that would be okay if they delivered a huge benefit. Of course, the benefits are very marginal, and they're marginal under contrived circumstances of clinical trials, which don't mirror the real world in a number of ways. One, they're not enrolling people who look like everyday Americans. Two, they're not using appropriate control arms. Three, they don't have the best available post-protocol care. Four, they're not measuring the endpoints that matter. Five, they're making up lies about why they're not measuring the endpoints that matter. They're saying it's taking too long when we've proven repeatedly that it doesn't take that much longer, and in some cases it's actually just as fast or shorter. And they have inappropriate dosing of control arm medications. They have inappropriate restrictions on concomitant medications. They have inappropriate use of censoring, and reliance on surrogate endpoints with censoring creates informative censoring. And all of these problems, they have non-inferiority margins that are so big, you can parallel park a school bus in them. All of these problems plague clinical trials. And as somebody said at the conference, and I really don't know if it was me or the person who came to the microphone, I do not have good evidence to make decisions for the patients who come in my clinic the way we're conducting oncology today. And I wholeheartedly agree. And that would be okay if the drugs were super cheap and had no toxicity, but the drugs are super expensive and they're really toxic. And that's why it's unacceptable. And throughout this discussion, I think it was abundantly clear that the Danes agreed. They didn't like the environment where KOLs who are being paid by the pharmaceutical companies are the ones telling us how we ought to use medications, even when they are getting things grievously wrong. They didn't like the fact that companies were simultaneously designing and conducting the clinical studies and also the beneficiaries of certain results, but not other results. I mean, it's so biased to me that you're telling me I run the trial. If I get a P of 0.049, I get $12 billion. If I get a P of 0.051, I forfeit the $700 million of drug development to that moment in time. That to me doesn't make a lot of sense. So Denmark, they agree with all these things. And let me come to the sort of the conclusion part of this. Why do we agree? I mean, why does an oncologist who was born in America, who have parents from India, who lived in America's whole life, and people in Denmark, doctors and researchers in Denmark, why do they agree so much? It seems like an unlikely pairing. And the answer is, of course, we agree because of two things we have in common. One, we agree about the values of society. And two, we agree about the method of science. Okay, let's talk about the values. What do we agree about? We believe that one of the key goals of society is to provide an equal playing field, equality of opportunity, so that anyone, through their own hard work, has a chance at succeeding. I think neither of us think that you ought to succeed merely by existing, but that you have a chance, that it's a level playing field, not that you ought to win no matter what. I think that's the modern perversion of this idea. But we agree, equality of opportunity, which means that if you happen to have rich parents or poor parents, society should make sure you get at least a good education, and at least make sure you don't go hungry, before you're 16 and 18 years of age. Society should have some safety nets so that if you fall on hard times, you have some cushion to prevent you from falling all the way down, and the hope that you'll get back up on your feet. And society should have some obligations to older people who just can't work like they used to. And I think we agree on that sort of philosophy of society, some lifting of everybody, and then you also allow people to succeed based on their own merit, of course. We agree on that vision. Now the method we really agree on is the use of best available evidence. It's that when you want to inflict or enact policies, you really have an obligation to know that they work, or if not, to test if they work. And you can't test if they work with some observational study that you can run 1,000 times and pick and choose the results you like. No, you need to have prospective, pre-specified, randomized control trials testing what you're saying. And if you don't, you got to take it away. You also have to have proportionality. You can't just implement policy because you want to punish somebody. You have to have proportionality. You can't just have a vaccine mandate and fire people from work because they tend to be from the other political party. That would be stupid. No, you have to have some fairness in the system. You have to have proportionality, which means that if kids are at ultra low risk, maybe you shouldn't push doggedly to vaccinate them with evidence that is also lacking in many key ways. We agree about evidence-based medicine. We agree about randomized trials. We agree what makes a good randomized study. We also are equally suspicious of lower levels of evidence. And that'll come across in the lecture I gave on real-world evidence. So when you pair these two things, you pair the vision of a society with the method for arriving at what policies are best, you find that I and Denmark are hand in hand. The Nordics and Vinay Prasad agree on pretty much everything. We agree on pretty much everything. And this is not new to COVID. Actually, we've agreed on pretty much everything for quite some time. And if you read the 2 books I've written, there's still a few people who know how to read. Not many, actually. That's really true. It's actually not many people read. Actually can even read and summarize accurately. That is really a lacking skill I've learned. But if you did, you would know that even when this guy, me, wrote the book in 2014 with Adam, that we have outlined many of the principles that we are carrying forward in the COVID-19 pandemic. Nothing has changed. Our principles are the same. What has changed is people are afraid, and they got very afraid for themselves, mostly, and they were happy to implement policy without evidence, and then they really didn't like the orange man, and whatever he said, they wanted to do the opposite. And that's the third thing that Denmark and I have in common, which is we live without thinking of the orange man all the time. We can live outside of the shadow of Donald Trump. I have to say, many of my academic colleagues cannot live outside his shadow. They're obsessed with the man. They have followed every move he makes, and they listen to everything he says, and they think whatever he says is wrong, so we have to do the opposite. I've never been obsessed with him. I can independently think. Sometimes he's right, sometimes he's wrong, and I can point out those two things. And in Denmark, they also have some distance from him, so they're not so wedded. Why does this make an important difference? Or why does this matter in this case? Because the reason why so many people in America think masks work so well is because he didn't want to wear one. So if he didn't want to wear one, it has to work, right? The reason why we close schools in certain cities and not other cities is because he wanted to reopen them. And if he wanted to do it, it had to be a bad idea, right? The reason why we really like lockdowns and restrictions is because he seemed like he didn't like it and did it unwillingly. And the reason why we initially in 2020 were very critical of vaccine safety. By the way, read my preprint. It's out on the servers now about the history of vaccine policy. We were very critical in 2020, but the moment he got booted out of office, we were very praiseworthy of vaccines, is again in a response to him because he launched Operation Warp Speed. So therefore, we had to point out how there could have been all these concerns. And not we, but some people had to try to slow the initial approval by changing the number of events after which they would look at the study results. So that's all detailed in my preprint. So why Denmark and I agree on everything? It's a combination of 3 things: shared values, shared method, and then the third thing, of course, is that we are not wedded to what the orange man does. It's really just that simple. That's the reason why the US got it wrong. That's the reason why sensible nations and sensible medicine have been in line. Norway, Denmark, concerns about myocarditis, excessive focus on vaccinating young people, pushing a vaccine that can't halt transmission. These are foolish things to do in ultra low risk populations. And if people were thinking more clearly, they would have agreed with me and Denmark. Cancer drugs that don't offer much benefits and are only tested in idealized populations can't cost $200,000 per year of treatment. That doesn't make any sense. Why should a society spend money on that and not good nutrition for children or universal childhood education or earlier childhood interventions? Why would a society do that? And the Danes and I agree wholeheartedly on that topic. People who don't agree are oncologists, actually, that's not true. The Danish oncologists and I agree. The people who don't agree are oncologists in nations where many of them are consulting for those companies. That's really the difference. In places where there's more neutrality, they do agree. So I think sensible medicine and my Substack and the Nordic philosophy is very much in line, both on all of the old issues in biomedicine and on all of the new ones during the pandemic. I think when you continue to follow this, you'll see that that is very true. And the last thing I'll say is the other thing we have in common is we're both correct. We're both right. We're both right on all these topics, whereas many of our critics are just plain wrong. They're wrong because they're not thinking clearly. They can't think about policy without anchoring to the orange man. And proof that they can't is that their feeds are a mix of naked political endorsement and also views on health policy. And the more you wed those two, the more you're incapable of using your own brain. And I also think most people don't read. I really do. I really do think that reading is very poor. All right, that's all for this video. I'll be back with more. We'll talk about things in future videos. Until next time.